Hey there, Pirate Monkey crew, and welcome to this ninth part of the Pirate Monkey Basic Series where we are going to be talking about wet pallets. So what is a wet pallet? The basic principle is that a wet pallet is a small, shallow container that we put a sponge in that holds the water, and then we put a piece of pallet paper on top of that. And what this allows us to do, especially with acrylic paints, because they are water-based, is that it allows us to keep those paints hydrated for a much longer time than we would normally be able to. This is fantastic for places where it is either very, very hot or very, very dry, and even places where it could potentially be a little bit humid as well, just because it's not going to allow those paints to get dried out because of that moisture that is being held in that reservoir of the wet pallet. Now, wet pallets are also extremely versatile in terms of the scale and how portable they can be. They can be anything from a very small Tupperware container or a plastic plate, all the way up to a very large 24 by 12 inch pallet that you can have in the studio. The question of what size of pallet that you should have is something that is entirely personal. I would highly recommend getting the Masterson medium size wet pallet. It is a 10-inch by 8-inch wet pallet that is fantastic to travel with, and it's just the right size for me in my studio. But again, this is something that you should definitely check out yourself. So what are some of the cons of a wet pallet? The first main one that I have noticed, and I hear from a lot of people who are getting into the miniatures hobby, is that it can over dilute the paint because of that transference between the sponge and the palette paper. Now, in the practical application part of this, I'm going to give you guys some tools to help you overcome that problem. Some of the other issues that you may encounter is actually the skill of setting up a wet palette. And there is a small amount of skill involved in doing this, surprisingly. But again, that is why we are making these tutorials, is to show you guys step by step how to do these things. And with that being said, we're actually going to go over to the table right now and show you guys how to make and set up your own wet palette. So come on with me and we'll get to it. Hey Pirate Crew, welcome to the table for this wet palette creation tutorial. So here I have my Masterson wet palette. This is my day-to-day palette that I use pretty much every day here in the studio, and as you can see, it's fantastic because it comes with a sponge. I'm going to show you how to create a wet palette with this, but also give you some ideas as to how to create a wet palette if you don't feel like spending money on something like this and you just want to try out the concept of a wet palette. So the only other things that you are going to be needing will be water. Of course, here I have water in this big jug. I keep this in the studio because I actually don't have plumbing in the studio. And then you're also going to need pallet paper. Personally, I use baking paper. This is a non-wax baking paper that you should be able to pick up just at about any supermarket or, you know, baking type of store. I haven't had any problems finding this either here in the States or internationally. So with that being said, let's go ahead and talk first about how much water to add. Now, this is one of the first subjects that really comes up. Now, if we just add a little bit of water like this isn't nearly enough water, right? It's not nearly enough. We can kind of see it, but we don't really see it on the surface shifting, but we see it down here in the bottom of the palette. Now, what we're going for is we want that water to be sitting just above the sponge. We want just enough that it's kind of floating over the sponge, and we can kind of see it moving when we do this, right? So this honestly is about a good amount of water, and hopefully you guys can kind of see it here as I touch the palette, right? And we can even add a little bit more just to be safe, because we really initially we want that paper to kind of be floating on top of that just a little bit. So the next thing that we're going to need, of course, is our palette paper. Here we have our palette paper, and then we are also going to need a couple of weights. I would say you need 4 weights, and for me personally, I just use paint bottles because they are just hanging out on the desk. They're always right there and ready to be used. If you really want to be speedy with this, we can place these kind of at both ends of the palette, and what we're going to do is we're going to place our paper in the water, and then we're very quickly going to put our weights on the 4 corners. Otherwise, we are going to see it roll up, and I'll show you that as well. So let's go ahead and put this in here. So I'm going to put these down here, and as we can see over on this end, this is going to start to curl up And it might happen if I place it in the water a little bit more dramatically, but as you can see, it's going to start to curl. And now we don't want this to happen, of course, because it's bothersome, right? It's difficult to put paint on our paper if it's all curled up and kind of doing whatever it wants. So it'll relax after some time, as you can see it doing right now, but generally I don't like to wait. I'm very, very impatient. So we're going to go ahead and place these weights on here. Another question that I get very, very frequently is what happens if I get droplets of paint on the pallet, kind of like I just placed on here. If you're getting droplets of water on the pallet, then you may need to practice just doing this initial process at first, because if we're doing this properly, we should get very, very little to none. The other reason why we get droplets of water like this on the pallet is if we've put the case on, you know, our pallet and we've let it rest overnight, and just due to humidity, some of these droplets have formed. So as you can see here, I've been brandishing a Q-tip. And essentially all we're going to do with a Q-tip is we are just going to wick up these little droplets of water, and we are just going to make sure that this pallet is completely free of these droplets. Now, sometimes if you would like, I actually intentionally place droplets of water onto the pallet in order to grab them and essentially use it to thin my paints. So that is something that is entirely up to you. It's entirely optional, and I would recommend that you kind of play around with that concept. So with that being said, of course, we have made our wet palette. As you can see here, I can kind of shift the paper. If you are having a difficult time doing this, then you probably don't have enough water in your palette. So just go ahead and add a little bit more. You can actually pour it just directly from, you know, whatever your container of water is. Then just kind of like lift the paper up or kind of crinkle the paper a little bit to allow the water to get underneath the paper. All right, so now that you have made your wet palette, we are going to go ahead and put a little bit of paint down on the palette. So I'm going to place some ultramarine blue from Vallejo. And so one topic that gets spoken about quite often is when people place paint down on their palette, they feel like it gets thinned down too much just from the diffusion of the water from the, you know, the container up through the paper and into the paint. Now, what I like to do to avoid this is I like to have a main pile right out of the bottle, and I will actually leave this. I'll just move it slightly over, and then I will thin this pile down separately. Now, this is great because of a couple of reasons, right? First of all, if it thins down through the paper, it's okay because we still have this thick pile. What we can do if it gets too thin is we can just grab a little bit of this and mix it in. This is also a great system because it will help you control the consistency of your paint as you are painting. A lot of times I find that as I use the techniques that we've talked about in, you know, the previous videos, that, you know, I want to shift between a little bit more thin or a little bit more thick, and this allows me to do that with a high amount of liberty. This is really my system of utilizing the wet palette and, you know, kind of avoiding that thinning process that a lot of us have experienced. So hopefully this section has been very, very helpful for you guys. And what we're going to do now is we're going to hop over and I'm going to show you how to create some wet palettes just out of some household materials. All right, so here we have this is just a regular old Tupperware container, nothing special about it. You can probably pick something like this up from a grocery store for just a couple of bucks if you don't have it in the house. And then of course here we have a bunch of paper towel. I have 2 to 3 sheets of it, and I'm just gonna make sure that I separate all 3 of them. What we wanna do is I like to just kind of fold these, and my goal is just to make sure that there aren't a lot of raised surfaces in this, right? So like in the corners, this is okay. It's not too bad. And what we want to do is we just want to build up a little bit of material, just so that when we place water in here, this is going to hold that water and not just quickly let it evaporate off. And of course, give our palette paper a little bit of something to hold on to. Now we're going to add some water. And we're looking for the exact same thing that we are looking for with the regular palette. And so of course, as we can tell here, this isn't enough water yet. It's not really, we can't see it really shifting across the surface. So we're gonna add a little bit more. And see how it's kind of floating in here now? You can see it kind of shifting. This is probably gonna be pretty good. All right, and so here I have a piece of palette paper again, and we are just going to set this in here and use our weights to hold it down. And we have made ourselves a little impromptu wet palette, just like that. Now, sometimes with paper towel, what you'll see is there's these bubbles. I just like to use my finger and I will push them out from underneath. Just like that. So what are some other things that we can make impromptu wet pallets out of? These plastic containers that a lot of our miniatures come in are extremely good for this. As you can see, they're just plastic. They're small. They're not going to allow liquid in. What I would recommend you against, though, is using any type of sponge or any type of foam that comes in. It's just not great at holding water, or it's not going to give the right kind of support to that pallet paper. So there's definitely things like this. Other things that you could use are something like this pencil case. This would be great as a wet pallet just because it has a cover. And then there's also something like this, right? Cotton swabs. It's a cotton swab container. I just pick it up at the grocery store. I need cotton swabs, and so when I'm done with it, I could use it as a wet pallet. So I'm not specifically recommending that you use all of those things as wet pallets. I'm just wanting to show you that you can definitely get creative if you want to save a little bit of your hobby money, or if you just want to try out the idea of a wet pallet before you spend money on a little bit of a nicer one like that Masterson one. That is really it, guys. That is wet pallets in a nutshell. I wanted to thank you guys all again so much for your support. If you guys have been enjoying these videos and you would like to support Pirate Monkey Painting, you can do that over at Patreon for as little as $1. If you support with $5, it gets you access to a massive tutorial library of over 35 hours of content. If you support at $15, it gets you access to weekly Photoshop feedback. So with all that being said, thank you once again. I hope this has been a useful tutorial for you, and happy painting. Bye.